Thank you very much. And thank you, Ryan, and thank you to the library for inviting me tonight. Okay. Sometimes we forget the human side of great events. We live our lives on a day-to-day basis, influenced by some degree by the outside world, outside forces. Occasionally, and no matter what we do to block them out, the events take precedent. And we have to adjust our own world to the times in which we live. COVID, case in point. The same was the same with the World War II generation, and the same with the Civil War generation. So what happened in Kalamazoo during the Civil War? What did the citizens do to support the war? Or not support the war? Who were these people? Kalamazoo County sent 3,321 soldiers to the war. 396 did not return. Now, the news of the fall of Fort Sumter on April 13th of 1861 was presumably a shock to the people of the village of Kalamazoo. And that shock soon turned to action. Now, on April 15th of 1861, a meeting of several prominent citizens of Kalamazoo took place in the law offices of John W. Bruce. Among those in attendance were Samuel Walbridge, Frederick Curtenius, Dwight May, United States Senator Charles Stewart, General Isaac Moffett of the War of 1812, and Judge Hezekiah Wells. And it was decided that a public meeting should be held the following evening. Fireman's Hall, located on Burdick Street, was a two-story building constructed in 1853. It was 82 feet by 41 feet and 32 feet in height, including the bell tower. The bell was used as the village fire alarm. The basement was divided into stalls for use as a city market. On the second floor, or the main floor, was a room for large gatherings to be utilized as a space for meetings of the several local organizations, including the Ladies' Library Association. The Kalamazoo Gazette described the interior of the upper floor during its construction. Quote, "This room will be 80 feet in length by 40 feet in width and 22 feet in height. It is to be furnished with movable seats that can be cleared away in a few moments' time, and a clear floor left in the event of its being wanted by any time for a festival or a ball." Now, the night of April 16th, a public meeting open to all residents of the village was called to order by Senator Stewart. Stewart gave a stirring speech, reviewing the previous 80 years of the history of the United States and how it grew and the prosperity that it enjoyed. He then turned the attention of the crowd to the threat of upheaval to their duly constituted republic. Senator Stewart hoped that the tenor of the meeting would be a desire for peace until all avenues for a conciliatory end were exhausted. He also stated that if war came, it would be the duty of Michigan and the village to respond to President Lincoln's call. His remarks were consistently interrupted with thunderous applause. Several other prominent citizens of Kalamazoo spoke that night. But then a committee was appointed by Senator Stewart to draft a resolution to express the sentiment of the citizens of Kalamazoo. Resolved, that this is the duty of the governor of the state to respond to the proclamation of the President of the United States and to take such action either in respect to legislation or otherwise shall be necessary to enable the state of Michigan to discharge her whole duty during the present crisis. And resolved, that in the common with all good and patriotic citizens, we most sincerely lament the present disturbed condition of our country, that to uphold its Constitution, to obey its laws, and sustain its constituted authorities is but the plain duty of all citizens, and one which should always be performed promptly and cheerfully, that we, the people of Kalamazoo here assembled, hereby pledge to each other and to our fellow countrymen the faithful discharge of all such obligations. The resolution was unanimously adopted. Kalamazoo's first volunteer was a 17-year-old by the name of William Shakespeare. He, along with his good friend George Shannon, decided that they wanted to do their part to preserve the Union. They enlisted in Company K on April 12, 1861. William, since he could read and write, was appointed corporal. The April 26th of 1861 edition of the Kalamazoo Gazette described the patriotic feeling in the village. Red, white, and blue are the favorite colors just now. Flags are flying from all public buildings, hotels, stores, and many private homes. There's a perfect mass meeting about the recruiting offices. It is said that the companies will be raised in the village readily. Now, I'm sure many of you recognize this building. The Kalamazoo Light Guard was the local militia company in Kalamazoo. It would meet on a monthly basis to train, drill, and parade through the streets of the town. The Light Guard maintained an armory located on the second floor of the Humphrey Block at the southeast corner of Michigan Avenue and Portage Street. This building, erected in 1855, still stands today. Now, the facade has been changed over the years, but it is still the same building. Muskets, cartridge boxes, ammunition, and equipment were stored in that building. The Light Guard, originally clad in gray with black trim, would soon have to change to Union blue. When the unit was accepted into the state service, it was designated as Company I and mustered into the 2nd Michigan Infantry. The second company to organize was the Kalamazoo Blair Guard, named for Governor Austin Blair. This company, when mustered into service, would be designated as Company K of the 2nd Michigan Infantry. The National Driving Park, located within the current bounds of the Washington Square neighborhood, was a nationally famous racetrack for harness racing. Owners and drivers came from all over the United States to prove who had the fastest horse. Built in 1858, the driving park also served as the county fairgrounds. And when the circus came to town, the environs would almost burst with humanity. A major part of Kalamazoo's contribution to the war effort was to provide a place for several regiments to rendezvous, train, and prepare for what was to come. Eventually, there would be 6 regiments of infantry, 1 regiment of cavalry, 1 company of sharpshooters, and 1 artillery battery that encamped and trained at the driving park. The horse stables, at first being used as barracks for the new recruits, were soon at capacity. A tent city was then erected. The infield of the track became the training ground. The soldiers learned to march and were drilled for hours in the warm spring sun. With this many men and boys coming together and doing their best to become some semblance of soldiers, accidents and illness were inevitable. The armory space in the Humphrey Block was converted into a makeshift infirmary, as there would not be a regular hospital in Kalamazoo for another 28 years, that being Borges. Between August of 1861 and June of 62, no less than 5 recruiting offices sprang up in the village. The 16th United States Infantry opened an office in the brick block opposite the post office. The 1st Michigan Cavalry was in the Burdick House Hotel on Main Street. The 13th Michigan Infantry was in the offices over L.W. Perrin's store, which was located on the corner of Main or Michigan Avenue and Burdick Street. The 17th Michigan Infantry was on the corner of Main and Burdick, and the 18th United States Infantry had an office somewhere in the city, but The location was never recorded. It was not very long after the excitement and flurry of the preparations for war began that the reality of the situation grasped the village. Death in its grim form visited the ranks of the eager enlistees encamped at the racetrack. As the Light Guard was drilling at the fairgrounds that spring, Henry Carrier, a 21-year-old tinsmith, caught a severe cold, which most likely turned into pneumonia. In a letter to the Kalamazoo Daily Telegraph dated May 31st, 1876, Mr. Oliver H. Perry, himself a veteran of the 5th Michigan Cavalry, wrote, "The first who fell, Henry Carrier, a young man employed by Walker, Sanger, and Edwards as a tinner, enlisted in Captain Dwight May's Company I of the 2nd Michigan. While the company was drilling on the fairground, Henry caught a severe cold which resulted in congestion and finally in his death. That occurred at Mrs. Perry's house, then living on Academy Street. Mr. Carrier's grave is unknown as a soldier, but he is as much entitled to the honors as that any that fell. Let us place his record upon a good, substantial tablet, that in the years to come he may be remembered." Now, there is no official record of Henry's death in the ledgers of the village or in the county. As he was never officially mustered into the service of the state of Michigan, he is not listed in the official records. Henry lies buried in Mountain Home Cemetery. Now, someone's heeded Mr. Perry's suggestion, because sometime later, a marble headstone, a good, substantial tablet, appeared on his grave. This privately purchased marble headstone tells of his sacrifice. It says, "Henry B. Carrier, age 21, first to fall of Kalamazoo Volunteers, enlisted for Company I of the 2nd Michigan Infantry." Now, the first Kalamazoo resident to die in battle was Private Theodore Lemon of Company K of the 2nd Michigan. Theodore was among those who enlisted on May 10th of 1861, along with William Shakespeare and George Shannon. He was killed in action on May 5th, 1862, at the Battle of Williamsburg, Virginia, during the Peninsula Campaign. He was 20 years of age. Now, the first to die of disease from Kalamazoo was Frank Taylor, also of the 2nd Michigan, a private of Company I. He died on October 11th, 1861, just several months after he enlisted. And he died at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. He was 23 years old. Frank was married to Miss Charlotte Ann Baxter on February 24th of 1861. Now, between 1862 and 1864, when all the troops were mustering and rendezvousing down at the fairgrounds, there were several soldiers, that died in camp or at the Armory Hospital. The remains of these individuals were taken to the newly established Riverside Cemetery on the east side of the Kalamazoo River. A lot in Section E had been set aside and is referred to in sources as the U.S. lot. The identities of these soldiers were lost by 1869 and are listed as unknowns in the official records of the United States government. It can be assumed that these men were not from the immediate area, because if they were, the families would most likely have either marked the graves or at the very least had the names recorded in the ledgers of Riverside Cemetery. So to this day, these graves remain unmarked. Just one of the fresh-faced young men of Kalamazoo who enlisted, this is John Jay Callahan. He enlisted on May 10th of 1861 and served in the 2nd Michigan Infantry. He was 20 years old and he also was a corporal. As the casualties mounted, including the officers, John was promoted through the ranks and eventually was commissioned a captain. He survived the war and was discharged July 28, 1865, as a brevet major for gallant and meritorious service during the war. This photo was taken early in 1865, and you can see he still has his lieutenant bars on his collar. The 6th Michigan Infantry was commanded by Colonel Frederick W. Curtenius, a prominent citizen of Kalamazoo, and he had served as a captain during the Mexican War. The regiment was mustered into service in August of 1861. By the summer of 1863, the 6th Michigan had been converted into a heavy artillery unit and had seen service serving 10-inch Columbiad cannon. Now, if you're familiar with a cannon down in Bronson Park, that is a 10-inch Columbiad, and that's what the 6th Michigan would have manned in fortifications, primarily in seacoast locations. The 13th Michigan Infantry was raised by United States Senator Charles E. Stewart, but was commanded by Michael Shoemaker. As soon as the regiment was formed and ready to go, Michael Shoemaker was put in command. Senator Stewart resigned his commission. The 13th was known as the Michigan Rifles and as Kalamazoo's own. This is what's left of the 13th Michigan Infantry's regimental flag, and this is in the collection of the state of Michigan. Now, while the 13th was encamped at the National Driving Park, several residents of Kalamazoo desired to provide the regiment with a stand of colors. The stand of colors would include a federal or U.S. flag and a regimental color. Unfortunately, the flags were on special order from New York City, and the flags did not arrive until after the regiment had left Kalamazoo. The flags arrived in time for Hezekiah Wells, the local judge, to go down to Kentucky to meet up with the regiment and present the flags. There's an account written about that. When they were received, they were at once set forward and presented at Nashville, Tennessee, on dress parade on February 12, 1862. They were of elegant silk and fine workmanship, with the inscription in gold letters, presented by the citizens of Kalamazoo to the 13th Michigan Infantry. When the regiment returned to Kalamazoo on veteran furlough in February of 1864, the flags were formally returned to the donors in an appropriate and earnest address by Surgeon Foster Pratt, and they were received on behalf of the village authorities by Judge Wells. And these flags had since been delivered to the state capitol for safekeeping. This is a reproduction of that same flag. You can see what most of the flag was missing. And as you can also see, the stars at the top represent the 32 states that were at that time in the Union. Now, the 13th Regimental flag was quite unique. Instead of being made of dark blue silk, like most of the Michigan Infantry regiments, the silk was light blue. The obverse, or the front, features the coat of arms of the state of Michigan, and above these are the words, presented by the citizens of Kalamazoo, and then 13th Michigan Infantry down below. This is Captain Clement Webb, a resident of Kalamazoo, who commanded Company E of the 13th Michigan. And he died February 16th of 1863 of wounds received at the Battle of Stones River, Tennessee on December 31st of 1862. And he's buried down in the Stones River National Cemetery in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. He was 31 years of age. The 25th Michigan Infantry was organized on September 22nd of 1862 here in Kalamazoo. It was commanded by Colonel Orlando H. Moore, a native of Schoolcraft, and he had served as lieutenant colonel for a while of the 13th Michigan. And here's Colonel Moore of Schoolcraft. The 25th Michigan's most famous action was the Battle of Tebbs Bend in Kentucky on July 4th of 1863. The Confederate forces attacked the entrenched 25th Michigan a total of 8 times and were repulsed each time. 200 rebel soldiers were killed that day. And in a general order written by General Hartstuff in complimenting Colonel Moore and the 25th Michigan, he wrote, "The entire arrangement of his defense entitles him to the highest credit for military skill. The obstinate defense made by Colonel Moore and his men delayed General John Hunt Morgan by 12 hours, which completely frustrated his plan of march and undoubtedly saved the city of Louisville, Kentucky from being looted by Morgan's men and the destruction of vast stores for the Union Army." At Tebbs Bend, there were only 260 men of the 25th Michigan present, and undoubtedly, at least a third of those men were from Kalamazoo. And this is what's left of the flag of the 25th Michigan Infantry. As you can see, it's dark blue, as opposed to the 13th Michigan's flag, which was the light blue. This gentleman may seem familiar to most of you, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Orcutt. He served under Orlando Moore, and before and after the war, Orcutt was the sheriff of Kalamazoo. Benjamin Orcutt also served in the Mexican War. He was a sergeant under Captain Frederick W. Curtenius. Now, in December of 1867, Sheriff Orcutt was killed in the line of duty. He was pursuing men who attempted to break some prisoners out of the jail. And at that time, the jail sat on the east end of Bronson Park. And it was a two-story wooden building. From what I've read, it was not very secure. The cells for the jail were upstairs. Orcutt and his family lived on the first floor, along with where his offices were. And that night in December of '67, two men tried to break out some of the prisoners upstairs in the middle of the night. Orcutt woke up, pulled on his pants and grabbed his revolver and headed out the door. The two men went around the backside towards the park and then went across rows and over to where the Kalamazoo Center or the hotel is today. Now, where the lobby of the hotel is, that was actually, there was an alleyway between two buildings. And in that alleyway, there was a large elm tree. And as Sheriff Orcutt came around the corner, one of the guys he was chasing was hiding behind that tree. And as the sheriff neared him, this guy shot Sheriff Orcutt and caught him in the shoulder. And it nicked an artery. Sheriff Orcutt stumbled back to the jail, and his wife said, "Did you kill them?" And he said, "No, they've killed me." And a couple of days later, Sheriff Orcutt died. This monument actually sits on the, on the island in the middle of Lane Boulevard, down in the Washington Square neighborhood. And this was erected by the survivors of the 25th Michigan Infantry about 1910. And it has the bronze plaque, has an eagle at the top, and it talks about the organizing of the 25th Michigan and how they encamped there near that spot. And unfortunately, the plaque on that boulder has been stolen twice. The original plaque is long gone. It was replaced in the 1980s by the Kalamazoo Historical Society, and within 2 months, that plaque was stolen. The third plaque, which is on there now, is stainless steel and is recessed into the stone, and it's still there after about 15 years, so maybe it's going to stay. The other regiments that were encamped at the driving park in Kalamazoo were the 28th Michigan Infantry, and this is all that remains of their colors. Just the tassels and the fringe. The 11th Michigan Cavalry, and there again, nothing much left of their flag. However, in Bronson Park across the street is this boulder with a bronze plaque. It was placed by the survivors of the 11th Michigan Cavalry in 1913. And here's a close-up of the plaque. And it was presented to the city in September of 1913. And it says, on the 50th anniversary of leaving for the front. I'm not quite sure if they were talking about just 1913 being the 50th anniversary, because the regiment actually left Kalamazoo in November of 1863. So I'm just guessing that they were taking advantage of the warm weather and dedicating their monument. Now this is called a guidon, and this was quite common for artillery units to carry this type of flag instead of the large 6 by 6.5 foot flags. And this is one of the very few artillery guidons in the state of Michigan's collection. But the 14th Battery of light artillery from Michigan organized in Kalamazoo, and it joined the United States service in January of 1864, and it left Kalamazoo on February 1st of 64. And it was sent to Camp Barry at Washington, D.C., which was an artillery training camp. And the 14th spent the war serving in the various forts that defended the ring around the capital city. And this is all that's left of the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters flag. Now, there was one company that organized and trained here in Kalamazoo, and most of the officers were not from Kalamazoo. Actually, Charles DeLand of Jackson was commissioned the colonel of the regiment. And however, one of the commissioned officers was from Kalamazoo. That was George Sheldon. He was the 2nd lieutenant in Company I of the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters. He was killed on the slope of Little Round Top in the Battle of Gettysburg, and he's buried in the section for United States troops in the National Cemetery, and he was only 22 years of age. Now, in the summer of 1861, the Democrats of Kalamazoo County were still clinging to the notion that outright war could be avoided, even after the several battles that had taken place already in Virginia. They promoted peace and conciliation and professed to be against coercion and war. A meeting was called to be held on Saturday, August 17th at 1 o'clock in Vicksburg. The speakers were Dr. Foster Pratt, the local physician, and Nathaniel Balch, who was the former prosecuting attorney of Kalamazoo. The event was reported on in the Kalamazoo Gazette, which told of the participation of some unwelcome visitors. From Kalamazoo, from Centerville, Mendon, from Schoolcraft, and from Waukesha and the surrounding countryside, the mob came. 1 senator, 2 former senators, a regent of the university, a postmaster, 1 sheriff, 1 former sheriff, 1 county clerk, no lawyers, 3 doctors, 3 abolition priests, several deacons, many members of churches, drunkards, thieves, and blacklegs by the score. So apparently those loyal to the Union and supporters of Lincoln felt that the rebel sympathizers were not going to be tolerated in Kalamazoo County. The Democrat speakers were consistently shouted down. Dr. Pratt asked those that were gathered there, "Do you propose to permit a rabble from Kalamazoo to come down here and dictate to you who you shall hear and who you shall not hear?" One man in the crowd shouted out, "We ain't all from Kalamazoo." At one point, George Winslow, local monument cutter from Kalamazoo, stood on a wheel of the wagon that was being used as the platform and asked if the Democrats would be willing to take an oath of allegiance. He proposed that the county clerk, Daniel Cahill, administer the oath, which stated, quote, "that we will support the Constitution and the laws of this state, the Constitution and the laws of the United States, and that we will give a cordial and hearty support to the administration of President Lincoln in the vigorous prosecution of the war to a successful termination, so help me God. Dr. Pratt, speaking on behalf of the Democrats assembled, declined to take the oath as it was presented. Now, during the proceedings, Orrin Giddings, who was a former county treasurer who represented Kalamazoo County in the Michigan legislature in 1847, related a conversation that he had with Dr. Pratt the previous day, and during which Dr. Pratt had expressed pleasure over the defeats of the Union Army. There were calls from the crowd to hang Dr. Pratt. Outnumbered 4-1, the Democrats decided to end their meeting. Dr. Smith, who was hosting Dr. Pratt, and Dr. Pratt left the grounds and went to Dr. Smith's home. They were all followed by the Union men. A meeting was held in the House, just the two of them, and a resolution was adopted, which included, in the fratricidal war with our brethren of other states, presents one of the darkest pages in the world's history, as it might have been and ought to have been prevented by conciliation and compromise. Well, by 1862, the Democrats of the county either had a change of heart or decided that a demonstration of their loyalty was warranted. Several Democrats, including Dr. Pratt, volunteered to serve in the 13th Michigan Infantry. Dr. Pratt was commissioned as the regimental surgeon. This is the monument to the United States Colored Troops, which stands in the Nashville National Cemetery at Nashville, Tennessee. Now, the 1850 census of Kalamazoo County reveals that there were 97 residents of African descent living in the county. Within 10 years' time, that number had grown to 305. Of these, 208 of these individuals, of these, 208 resided in the village limits of Kalamazoo. The 1860 census also shows that 23 of these individuals worked as day laborers, 14 were skilled tradesmen. This included 8 barbers, a brick or stone mason, 2 shoemakers, 3 seamstresses or dressmakers, and 1 carpenter. Other occupations listed were 6 farmers and 8 farm laborers, 10 washerwomen, a well digger, a hotel waiter, and 1 Baptist preacher, the Reverend Mr. Dooling. Now, at the outbreak of the Civil War, there were no provisions for men of color to enlist in the Union Army. Many black men, however, were serving in the United States Navy. Henry Barnes, the editor of the Detroit Advertiser and Tribune, continually called in his editorials for the allowing of black men to enlist. He reported that Army recruiters from New England had been in Michigan, mostly in Detroit and Battle Creek. They were signing up young men to serve in a brand new regiment, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. Some of you may recall the 54th Massachusetts and the movie Glory. In the summer of 1863, with this frustration at a boiling point, newspaperman Barnes contacted the War Department in Washington, D.C., requesting permission to raise a black regiment in Michigan. On July 24th of 1863, Secretary of War Stanton wrote to Michigan Governor Austin Blair, authorizing the organization of such a regiment. Now, this regiment would be first designated as the 1st Michigan Colored Infantry, which would be federalized after it was accepted into service as the 102nd United States Colored Troops. 7 black men from Kalamazoo served in the 102nd. Lovett Hammond, who was born in North Carolina in 1830, joined Company K. Thomas Woodford, who was born a slave in Kentucky in 1835, also served in Company K. Rix Hammond was born into slavery in Halifax County, North Carolina in 1832. On October 27th of 1863, at the county courthouse here in Kalamazoo, his was one of several names drawn from the wooden draft box. And that wooden draft box is still here in Kalamazoo, and it's in the museum just down the street. Rix was 31 years of age, and he was originally assigned to Company F of the 2nd Michigan Infantry, 2nd Michigan Cavalry. So as far as known, he is the only black man to serve in the 2nd Michigan Cavalry. He was transferred to Company I of the 102nd and joined his new regiment in May of 1865. But it's not known for sure if Ricks and Lovett Hammond were actually related. Now, it seems quite coincidental that they were both born in North Carolina, 2 years apart, with the same last name. Next, we have Aaron Burnett. He is listed in the 1860 census as an 18-year-old laborer. He's enlisted in Company K. Elijah Harris, born in Tennessee, enlisted in Company B. And subsequent records and his VA headstone in Riverside shows his last name to be Harrison. Edward Kersey, born in Indiana, took up residence in Pavilion Township. Stephen White was born about 1826. Edward Kersey and Stephen White both served in the 102nd. But after the war, there was a large influx of black veterans into Kalamazoo. By the 1890s, a total of 34 black veterans resided here in Kalamazoo. Many would come to Kalamazoo, marry, and raise families. 22 of those men had actually served with the 102nd. Albert Whaling, also known as John Freeland, lived in Kalamazoo after the war and died in 1934. He was the last black veteran in Kalamazoo. Albert is interred at the Orchid Post number 79 lot in Riverside Cemetery, and he served in Company C of the 5th United States Colored Cavalry. To this day, he still has family members that come up and decorate his grave every day or every year for Memorial Day. The Ladies Soldiers Aid Society of Kalamazoo was organized in 1861 to furnish soldiers from Kalamazoo with basic needs that were either not met by the Army or that were not readily available. Membership in the Ladies Aid Society was open to any woman who wanted to aid the cause and included the wives, the mothers, and the sisters of the soldiers. They would knit socks, make shirts, bake pies, and preserve various types of food to send to the boys in the field. And at times, they assisted the families of those soldiers that were still here at Kalamazoo. In 1862, Cornelia Stockbridge Sheldon was elected president of the society, and Lucinda Hinsdale Stone was the secretary. Ruth Webster was the treasurer. In 1863, Ruth Potter was elected the president, and Cornelia Sheldon as secretary. These ladies served in their respective capacities until the close of the war. Interestingly, but not surprising, these women were also members of the Kalamazoo Ladies Library Association. There we go. There's another view of the National Driving Park. In 1863, the ladies organized a state sanitary fair to raise money for the care of the sick and the wounded. The fair was to coincide with the annual Michigan State Agricultural Fair, which was actually being held here in Kalamazoo. It was recorded that the fair was eminently successful. Again, the next year in 1864, again during the State Agricultural Fair, another sanitary fair opened in Kalamazoo on September 20th and ran for 4 days. The Sanitary Fair building that was erected especially for the event stood 100 feet by 60 feet. It was designed to be temporary, so that at the end of the fair, the lumber used in its construction could be sold off and the money raised could be put into the fund. For a second time, it was held at the National Racetrack. The Kalamazoo Telegraph described the interior of the building. The profusion of evergreen trimmings makes the site a beautiful one. On either side of the building, within wreaths of the same material, are the names of the brave sons of America, who are the gallant leaders of our Army and Navy. Such names as Burnside, Grant, Meade, McClellan, Sherman, Farragut, and Porter stand forth in prominence. Exhibited on the west end of the hall, the battle flags of some of the Michigan regiments, tattered and torn, which give ample proof to the part borne by their followers on the battlefields, which have immortalized the names of Michigan soldiers. These, 14 in number, the flags, were furnished for exhibition by the kindness and liberality of Adjutant General Robertson, as were also 3 rebel stands of colors, taken as trophies in fair fight, and sent home to their friends by our soldiers as evidence of Michigan's bravery and valor. The display of Michigan regimental battle flags generated the most interest among the visitors. Many comments were overheard, including, "My son fought under that flag," and sometimes sadly followed by, "and he fell in battle." Booths within the hall were set aside for each of the ladies' organizations from the several counties, including Wayne, Calhoun, Van Buren, Hillsdale, Allegan, Jackson. Many others participated as well. At each booth, ladies displayed items to be purchased to raise funds, items such as paintings, quilts, animals, farm implements, musical instruments, and many handmade items were available for purchase, all donated for the event. Also within the hall was a booth which included a ballot box. For 25 cents, a patron could cast a straw ballot for President of the United States. The result of the election was as follows: 260 for Abraham Lincoln, 116 for General George McClellan, 2 for John C. Fremont, and 1 for Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Now, each of the 4 days saw thousands of Michiganders purchase tickets and walk through those gates. On Thursday, September 22nd, Governor Austin Blair came down from Lansing and addressed the crowds, thanking them for their continued support of the troops. His hour-long speech was well received by those in attendance. At the end of the 4-day fair, the receipts were totaled, and $12,764.80 was raised. In 2021 dollars, that would equal $210,316.75. Yes, it was a success. Now, the efforts of the society were not limited to state fairs, but went on year-round. In December of 1863, the ladies publicly acknowledged generous donations of fruits and vegetables and listed funds collected in Pavilion and Brady Townships and in the village of Climax, which totaled $27.80. Again, in 2021 funds, that would equal $569.49. Cornelia Stockbridge Sheldon was born in Bath, Maine, and she married Theodore Pierce Sheldon of Kalamazoo sometime between 1857 and 1860. Mr. Sheldon was a prominent banker in Kalamazoo, and Miss Stockbridge was a former school teacher in Allegan. Mrs. Sheldon served as the president of the Ladies' Aid Society in 1862. Mrs. Sheldon's brother, Francis Brown Stockbridge, you may be familiar with Stockbridge Avenue, was a United States Senator from Michigan, serving from 1887 to 1894. Mrs. Ruth Webster served as the treasurer for both the Ladies' Aid Society and the Ladies' Library, in the latter position serving for 24 years, and was the librarian for 15. She donated the land on Park Street that the Ladies' Library Association erected their building in 1878. Charity Potter was largely known as being devoted to community affairs. True to her name, Charity, Mrs. Potter was involved in several charitable endeavors throughout her lifetime. She and her husband, Alan Potter, came to Kalamazoo in 1845 from Lockport, New York. Mr. Potter established a hardware business in Kalamazoo and later served as vice president of the board of directors of the Michigan National Bank in Kalamazoo. Upon incorporation of Kalamazoo as a city in 1884, Mr. Allen was elected its first mayor. Anne Eliza Sill resided at 328 Rose Street here in Kalamazoo. And for many years, she was an active member of the Ladies' Library Association Her husband, Dr. Joseph Sill, died in 1905 at the age of 83. He was a practicing physician here in Kalamazoo for over 40 years. Now, unfortunately, this next lady I don't have a picture of. Miss Mary Penfield was an early member and director of the Ladies' Aid Society, and she took it upon herself to do what she could to alleviate the pain and suffering of wounded soldiers. From 1862 to 1865, Mary served as a nurse, working in several military hospitals in places around Kentucky and Mississippi. Now, nurses during the war were looked upon with the utmost gratitude by the soldiers. Now, after returning to Kalamazoo at the close of the war, Mary served several years as the librarian for the Ladies' Library Association. Mary was born in New York in 1827 and died in Kalamazoo in 1897. She was interred in Mountain Home Cemetery. As a side note, in about 1890, many of the soldiers here, the veterans here in Kalamazoo, petitioned Congress to award Mary a pension for her services. And through the work of Mr. Stockbridge and others, she did receive that pension, and she collected it until she died. On Sunday, April 2nd, 1865, the news of the fall of the capital of the Confederacy was greeted throughout the North with great excitement. 31 years later, Captain Charles May, formerly of the 2nd Michigan from Kalamazoo, wrote of his memory of the occasion, quote, "Here in Michigan, it was a warm, genial April morning, and we got the news by 9 o'clock. Men filled the streets with excited, beaming faces. They shook hands with each other. The news spread from house to house. Richmond has fallen. Our army is in its streets. The flag is waving over the rebel capital. Lincoln is there. The city is on fire, and our soldiers are fighting the flames." All day the good news spread throughout the town and throughout the country. No business was done. The happiness was universal and supreme. When night came, the whole population, with half the county besides, it seemed to me at least, was in the streets. Bonfires of tar barrels, dry goods, boxes, and other combustible material were lit, and the whole heavens were illuminated with the brightness of day. From the balcony or iron railing in front of William B. Clark's store on Main Street, I was called to speak, was witness to such a scene as was never presented to me before and never can be again. Talk about crowds, about enthusiasm. Kalamazoo was not half as large as it is today, but from the courthouse square to the Kalamazoo House and Portage Street, it was one dense, solid mass of humanity, excited and thrilled as only men can be by a crowning victory at the end of a great 4 years' war. Now, in the following days, all of Kalamazoo and the surrounding villages would watch for any news of Grant's pursuit of Lee's army. The Union finally caught up with Lee at Sailor's Creek, and then finally at Mr. Wilmer McLean's parlor, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Captain May continues, "It was the 9th of April, less than a week after the fall of Richmond. The scene that now occurred here in Kalamazoo, in Michigan, all through the North begs description. Great was the excitement and the joy over Richmond. There was some repose, some self-control, some attempt at orderly and concerted expression of the public feeling. But now pandemonium was let loose. There was no order, no reserve, no self-control. The excitement, so to speak, took the form of spontaneous individual explosion. Sober citizens yelled and shouted like wild men. They ran about the streets. They embraced and hugged each other like girls. As under ether or laughing gas, each man showed out under that excitement his own nature. Some wept, some laughed. Men and boys ran shouting through the streets or rode horses or donkeys up and down, ringing bells and blowing horns. Some rushed into saloons to treat others and to drink. Others tried to drag men up to the public bars who were never seen there. But all in this wild excitement, there were, of course, sober, patriotic citizens who did not indulge in these grotesque extravagances or to seek or blunt or drown their senses in drink. But with hearts full of joy and gratitude, they stayed in their homes all day for this great victory. Now that at last the wicked rebellion was crushed, and the majesty and power of the government vindicated, and slavery, the hateful and barbarous institution, the cause of all the trouble, wiped out forever. Many families, not only in Kalamazoo, but in Climax, Schoolcraft, Richland, and Galesburg, greeted the news with thoughts of their loved ones that would be coming home soon. Many others were both joyous and saddened, for their father, their son, or their brother would not be returning home. And the blessed thought, too, that there would be no more bloodshed, no more precious lives lost, but white-winged peace would again cover the land, and grim visage of war, with all its long train of horrors, retire before the glad opening of the spring. On Friday, April 14th, 1865, Good Friday in the Christian tradition, life went quietly on as usual, except for the overlying happiness due to the cessation of hostilities. The atmosphere in Kalamazoo was cheerful and optimistic. In 24 hours, that cheerful optimism would become anguish and incredulity. It was the morning of Saturday, April 15th, that the news of Lincoln's assassination reached Kalamazoo by telegraph. Captain Charles May again wrote of his observations, this time as to the village's anguished reaction. Quote, "On the way to my office that morning, as I was passing through Bronson Park, an excited neighbor met me with the exclamation, 'Awful news! Lincoln and Seward both assassinated.' I can go to the spot within a foot where I then stood transfixed. And how strange that it should have been within 20 feet of where Lincoln had stood when he spoke in Bronson Park several years before. A few moments later, I was downtown in the streets at that early hour, and they were already full of people. There was no noise, no outcry, no running to and fro. Men seemed crushed by the news, their faces blanched, their voices hollow. Here and there would be a ripple of outward excitement as some rebel sympathizer who had unguardedly expressed his delight was set upon by the indignant crowd. When Mr. Stanton's first dispatch was read saying that there was no hope, and his last announcing in the briefest, saddest words of the president's death, a convulsive shudder ran through the multitude, and an awful groan, a sound of pain, which was heard, which words cannot describe. Captain May continued, saying that while the residents were in a state of disbelief, there were no public announcements or formal statements made by village officials. There were many people in the streets, their numbers increasing as the day went by. Yet, there would be no unified outpouring of grief. Each person seemed to hold their sorrow inward. Another underlying concern was the distinct possibility that there would be more horrifying news to come out of Washington. Captain May continued, "But all the day the bells tolled sadly in their steeples, the bells that only yesterday, as it were, had pealed forth their glad tidings and chimes over the nation's great victory. But towards evening, some men, and especially many women, bethought themselves that tomorrow would be Sunday, and the stores would soon rid their stock of velvet and black crepe, and busy hands that afternoon draped all the churches, pulpits, walls, and the public buildings and places of business were also hung in mourning. Every private house, too, was draped in some fashion, as though it contained its own beloved dead. The whole land was clothed in funeral black that Sunday afternoon, and on the morrow, all the loyal churches in the loyal North were in deepest mourning, with emblems filled with solemn mourning congregations." With the war ended and the promise of the troops returning home, the citizens of Kalamazoo could begin to settle again into daily life. Eventually, Kalamazoo would return to some semblance of normalcy. There would always be reminders of the 4 years of war, as a veteran on the street was missing an arm, or an old soldier walking with crutches. The world in which Kalamazoo lived would never quite be the same, but Kalamazoo survived. Thank you. Be happy to try to answer any questions you might have. Sir.
You mentioned two really quite odd monuments. Kalamazoo. Are there other Civil War, other monuments to the Civil War soldiers in Kalamazoo area?
Oh yes, there are several actually. Starting with Bronson Park, you have the cannon, which was brought in 1898 by the Civil War veterans. Now, funny story about that cannon. If you look at the rim of the muzzle of the gun, it has the date 1860. But if you look really close, you can see it says 1866. So that gun was not even in the Civil War, but it was given by the federal government to the veterans here in Kalamazoo as a memorial. The 11th Michigan Cavalry Monument in Bronson Park. You have up in Riverside Cemetery, there is a section of the cemetery set aside way up in the top, in the middle of the cemetery. There's 125 Civil War veterans buried there together. And there is a large monument in the middle of the lot. It's probably 28 feet tall, and it has a 7-foot tall soldier on top made of gray granite. There are, like I say, 125 veterans buried there. Several of them are Navy sailors. Let's see. You have a monument in Schoolcraft in the cemetery right off of US 131. It was erected by the members of Burson Post number 303, the Veterans Post, the Grand Army of the Republic. There's a monument in Fulton, in South Fulton Cemetery, which was erected by the veterans of Fulton. There is one in Vicksburg in the cemetery. Right as you drive in the old section of the cemetery on the north side, there's the monument and there's a flagpole. And that was erected by the veterans in Vicksburg. Let's see. There is no monument in Galesburg. That surprises me, but there's not one there. Let's see. Oh gosh, Patty, you're going to have to help me out. Am I missing anything? Yeah, so there are several. There's actually a tree over in Bronson Park in the semicircle with all the monuments. It's called the GAR tree. The local post here in Kalamazoo, Orchid Post number 79, planted a tree in 1909. And that tree survived for 100 years. It even survived the tornado of 1980. But it eventually succumbed to disease, and it was replaced, about 6 years ago by the local Sons of Union Veterans organization here in Kalamazoo. Seems like there's one more someplace that I'm missing, but there are several in Kalamazoo. The largest, of course, is the one in Riverside Cemetery. And if you haven't,
the library will be closing in 30 minutes.
If you haven't visited the Civil War Veterans lot in Riverside, I would encourage you to go up and check it out. I mean, just wander around and look at the headstones. There are a lot of stories. If you're familiar with my book, in the back of the book there are a baker's dozen of stories about veterans, and all those veterans are buried up in the cemetery there. Okay. Anybody else? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your attendance. Thank you.